Well, hello and welcome once again to Beat the Reset. My name is Tim and I am the guy in the hat. And today I wanted to talk to you about the United Nations, the real United Nations. And I spoke about this recently in a live podcast on my channel. But today what I wanted to talk about is how I came to this information and why it is important. I have researched MX technologies, which are the new central bank telecommunications technologies that will be largely in operation after November 2025. And these MX technologies underpin the messaging systems of the central banks. These technologies are particularly important because what they do is they enhance the type of messaging that can go on between the central banks and between the largest of the commercial banks through something called interbank communications. Currently, it's handled by an organisation known as SWIFT, which stands for the Society of Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. So what we're dealing with here is telecommunications. And right from the outset, it's really important to understand this word telecommunications. How important it is, I cannot overstate its importance and its relevance within everything that we do, everything we share, all the information that we discuss on the channel. Everything is to do largely with telecommunications. And what I did is, as I researched MX technologies, which are largely part of a set of standards which are known as ISO 20022, or sometimes it's called ISO 20022. Now, these standards are set by a globalist organisation, a globalist organisation known as the International Organization for Standardization, commonly referred to as its acronym ISO, and it sets the standards for all, effectively, the standards for everything, for the construction industry, for currencies, for country codes. For example, country codes are ISO 3166. If you look at currency codes, ISO 4217. If you look at telecommunications messaging of the central bank system, ISO 20022, and so on and so forth. And the thing that's worth noting is that the International Organization for Standardization sits under the banner of the United Nations. So the United Nations is a conglomerate of many, many things. It's not just one thing, it's many, many things, with the UN sitting at the very, very top and all its subsidiaries such as the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, and so on and so forth. But for the purposes of this video and this podcast today, what I wanted to talk to you about is where this all really goes and why it's relevant, of course, to the topic that Beat the Reset focuses on the most, which of course is global monetary systems. So let's start again. So we've got the MX technologies, which, as I said, will largely come into play on in November of 2025. And as I followed this thread backwards, what I was looking for is what really predated the MX system. So we've got the MX system coming in. Well, the system that predated all of that was something called the MT system. And this was part of the SWIFT system. As I said, this is a Belgian-based system. As I said, the acronym is the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. Now, this was formed in 1973, so it's about 50 years old as of the recording of this podcast. So about 50 years ago, we have the development of this telecommunications system between the central banks. But then I started following that back a little further, and I got back a little earlier to an organisation that was formed in essentially 1947, and it was known as the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. Now, this seemed to predate SWIFT, so this took me from 1973. It took me all the way back to 1947. Now, even though the ITU was largely rebranded in 1947, yes, rebranded, and I'll get to that in a minute, it didn't really see its inception until 1949, the 1st of January 1949. So there was a couple of years between its inception as something that sat under the banner of the United Nations to its actual inception. And what it handles is quite startling. The ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, is literally the central hub for all communications on the globe. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the things that the ITU handle are, of course, global communications. We're talking about broadband. We're talking about shipping lanes, flight paths, satellite orbits, fibre optic cable, radio spectrum, Morse, we've got teleprinting, we've got telex, we've got semaphore. There's all sorts of communication standards and communications around the world, and telecommunications in general, all the mobile networks, all the internet cabling. I mean, essentially all of this is set by the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, which surprisingly sits under the banner of a globalist organisation known as the United Nations, of which there are, of course, 193 signatory countries out of 195. And the United Nations, which was formed on the 26th of June 1945, just prior to the end of the war in the Pacific in World War II. So the United Nations has been around for a while. It initially commenced with just 50 countries that were signatories. As I mentioned, there's 193 now that are current signatories. There are two that are not signatories to the United Nations, and those countries, of course, are the Holy See, which is largely known in its colloquial term as the Vatican, and, of course, the Islamic State of Palestine. So these two are not signatories. These two sovereign nations, of the 195 sovereign nations on Earth, only 193 are signatories. So let's move on, because, of course, the United Nations took over from the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was formed in 1920, just after the First World War, and it was, again, its stated purpose was similar to the United Nations. The League of Nations was formed at the Paris signing, or the treaty that essentially ended the First World War and set about a new structure for the world on a global scale. And the stated purpose of the League of Nations was, of course, to prevent further wars, of course, which it was unable to do. So effectively, it was disbanded at the beginning of the Second World War, which was the obvious sign that it was unable to prevent any wars at all, which does beg the question, and beg the question to the guy in the hat about what exactly are these organisations doing if they can't prevent war. Now, of course, the United Nations, which took over in 1945, also had a stated purpose, was to protect the world's security and to make sure there were no more wars. Of course, none of these things seem to be happening at the UN. So the question is, what exactly is the UN? What is their purpose? Where did they come from, and why are they really there? I mean, if the one stated purpose, if their mission statement can't be achieved, which is to protect the world and, essentially create world peace, then what exactly is the United Nations doing? Because it doesn't seem to be any good at its stated mission. And this is really where it gets interesting, because as I went backwards, I got to the League of Nations in 1920, and then I went back further, and of course we go past dystopian institutions like, of course, the Federal Reserve, which of course came into being on the 23rd of December 1913, and then we go back even earlier. We go past the 1900 and go earlier. We had the Gold Reserve, or the Gold Standard Act of 1900, back to the Coinage Act of 1873, and start to see some just really dystopian stuff. Lots and lots of resets in that period, of course, and all the way back to the year 1865. And when I reached 1865, things got super interesting straight away. And in 1865, it's an iconic year because, of course, many things happened in that year. In the April of 1865, we had the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And, of course, there was also the end of the American Civil War, which is highly questionable in what its actual purpose was. And once again, the American Civil War was another 4-year war, as we saw in 1914 to 1918. So similar kind of things there. But more importantly, we see the creation creation of an institution that was the very, very first remnants of the United Nations. In fact, the United Nations in its earliest form was known as the ITU. Now, I did mention the ITU just moments ago in this podcast. That was, I said effectively it had been rebranded. So the ITU had been rebranded in 1947 as the International Telecommunications Union. Now, that's plausible in 1947, but would you believe that in 1865 the ITU was also in existence? It's like a scene out of Back to the Future. You realise the ITU was absolutely operational in that in 1865. Many years, 80 years before the United Nations was even in play. And the ITU in 1865, its acronym stood for the International Telegraphic Union. It was formed on the 17th of May, 1865. Now, its purposes are similar to the International Telecommunications Union that was set up in 1947, nearly 100 years later. So it too was responsible for telecommunications around the globe. That's right. 1865. It turns out that not is all as it seems. It looks like we may have been dealt a sleight of hand in regards to communications and how advanced we really were back in 1865. But here's the interesting thing, is that this was the first department. The ITU was classified and is classified in history as the first department of the United Nations. So in other words, the United Nations' earliest iteration was not as a globalist organisation that was controlling everything on the planet, but as a telecommunications, international telecommunications network for the purposes of two things, in my opinion. Now, these are my opinion. The first one is to control the banking systems and the control of currency on a global basis, and that's right. The central banks were trading in real time in 1865. Can you believe that? Real time. And the second part was for surveillance, for the surveillance of the common man, to listen into Morse, semaphore, telex, teleprinting, and all of the above. But interestingly enough, as I went back in history to earlier forms of the ITU, the very next institution that I came across was the Bank of England in 1717. So I've gone from 1865 to 1717. And of course, in that year, we saw Sir Isaac Newton debase silver, which of course the United States government did in 1873. So in 1717, the exact same antics we see going on in the Bank of England with Sir Isaac Newton debasing silver. All imports were paid for in silver, all exports were paid for in gold. But in the same year, we see the formulation of the Freemasons. That's in 1717 in England. We also see, as I went back even further, to an incredibly iconic year in 1660, known as the Society of London, or the London Society, or the Royal Society, as it's sometimes called. Now, the Royal Society in 1660, again, has links to the Freemasons. Once again, these organisations are all kind of linked through telecommunications. So through time, we are seeing the same repetition of history. And this is really the UN going back to the ITU in 1865, going back to the Bank of England in 1717, going back to the Royal Society in 1660, and then even earlier than that in 1646, more references to the Freemasons and where they originated in something called the Invisible College. So these are institutions that we've largely forgotten and have no knowledge of anymore. But all of these institutions through time have some very, very big commonalities. The first of them is, of course, Freemasonry. The second one is that they're telecommunications businesses. The third one is that largely connected to central banks, because central banks control currency flow around the world. And the fourth one is surveillance of the common man. And so if you thought that technology was a relatively new thing, I've got some very, very interesting news for you. And that is, of course, that in the 1890s, we see the relevance, and we see 5G in the 1890s. Correct. You heard that correct. And in the late 1890s, we see 6G technology. Now, how far back this technology goes, I still haven't found the origins of 5G and 6G, but I would beg to differ that it actually goes a long, long way back. So back in 1646, under the Invisible College, of course, was a group of scientists and academics and apparently naturalists that were in charge of basically controlling the direction of the planet from a scientific point of view. That also was the stated purpose of the Royal Society. But of course, all of these have links to central banks and globalists, which have links to the Freemasonry. So, of course, this is why this is like a thread through time, which all started through something called telecommunications and the guy in the hat following the MX technologies of the International Organisation for Standardisation, all the way from November 2025 right back to 1646, and it goes even earlier than that. But for the purposes of this podcast, I just thought I would introduce you to the real United Nations and what they are about and where they came from roughly. There is much, much more on this topic I'd like to talk about, but of course I only do these in 15-minute blocks to make it nice and consumable so that you can kind of get your daily fix of information. But I hope that you can use this information, of course, to do your own research and to expand on some of the topics I've spoken about here. So the key dates to take away, just to finish, 1646, which is the Invisible College, the Royal Society, which is 1660, Sir Isaac Newton and the Central Bank and Freemasonry in 1717, the inception of the International Telegraphic Union in 1865, May 17, the, of course, creation of the League of Nations in 1920, its wind-up in 1939, the creation of the United Nations on June 26, 1945, the creation of the International Organisation of Standardisation in 1947, the creation of the International Telecommunications Union also in 1947 with an inception date of 1949, the SWIFT system, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications in 1973, and of course the MX system, which is of course ISO 222, and then you get to modern day. So there it is. I hope you've enjoyed some of this journey today with the guy in the hat from Beat the Reset. As always, I hope you're looking after your health, I hope you're looking after your wealth, and as always, make good choices.